The sun hung mercilessly over the Arizona territory, its rays beating down on the dusty trail that wound through red rock formations and scattered sagebrush. The year was 1885, and this remote path saw few travelers. Most folks preferred the main roads closer to the railroad towns, but sometimes people chose the lonely routes for reasons they couldn't speak aloud. Sarah Mitchell stumbled along the rocky ground, her torn dress catching on thorny bushes. Dark bruises painted her pale arms in shades of purple and yellow, and dried blood caked the corner of her mouth. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. Each step sent waves of pain through her ribs, but she pressed forward, driven by a desperate need to put distance between herself and the town of Copper Creek. The desert heat made her vision blur. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the last of her water had run out that morning. Her husband's angry words still echoed in her mind. "You'll never survive out there alone, Sarah. You'll come crawling back." The memory of his fist connecting with her cheek made her wince, but she'd rather die in this wasteland than return to that house of fear. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah's legs finally gave out. She collapsed beside a large boulder, her body shaking from exhaustion and shock. The desert around her was eerily quiet, except for the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She closed her eyes, wondering if this was how her story would end, alone and forgotten in the vastness of the Arizona wilderness. From somewhere nearby came the soft sound of footsteps on gravel. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart racing with fresh terror. Had Thomas found her? Had he sent his brothers to drag her back? She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left. A shadow fell across her face, blocking the harsh sunlight. Sarah looked up and found herself staring at a man unlike any she'd ever seen. He was tall and lean, with weathered bronze skin and long black hair that caught the wind. His clothes were simple, worn leather pants and a cotton shirt the color of desert sand, but it was his eyes that held her attention, dark brown, almost black, and filled with a quiet intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He was Apache. Sarah had heard the townspeople in Copper Creek speak of them in hushed, fearful tones. Stories of raids and violence filled the local newspapers, but looking at this man now, crouched beside her with concern etched on his features, she felt no fear, only a strange sense of calm. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Without a word, the Apache man reached for a leather water pouch at his side. He lifted Sarah's head gently, supporting her as she drank. The water was warm, but tasted like life itself. When she'd had enough, he carefully lowered her head back down. Sarah studied his face as he examined her injuries with practiced eyes. There was no judgment there, no questions about how she'd come to be in such a state. His touch was gentle as he checked her pulse and looked at the worst of her bruises. "Can you stand?" he asked quietly. His English was accented but clear. Sarah tried to push herself up, but her body betrayed her again. The Apache man, she realized she didn't even know his name, slipped one strong arm around her waist and helped her to her feet. She leaned against him, surprised by how steady and warm he felt. "My camp is not far," he said simply. "You need shelter." Trust was not something that came easily to Sarah anymore. Every instinct told her to be wary of strangers, especially men. But something about this quiet Apache touched a place in her heart that Thomas had never been able to reach. Perhaps it was the way he asked nothing of her, expected nothing, or maybe it was simply that she had no other choice. She nodded weakly, and together they began the slow journey across the desert floor toward the distant mountains. As they walked, Sarah noticed how he moved, with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape. He seemed to know every rock and bush, every safe place to step. The sun was setting by the time they reached his camp, hidden in a shallow cave among the red cliffs. It was simple but well organized, a small fire pit, some cooking implements, blankets and supplies neatly arranged against the cave walls. The entrance was cleverly concealed by hanging brush that would be invisible to anyone passing below. The Apache man helped Sarah settle onto a soft pile of blankets near the back of the cave, then moved to start a small fire. As the flames began to dance, casting warm light on the cave walls, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Safety. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He paused in his fire tending and looked at her across the flickering light. "Nalnish," he said. "It means he works." "I'm Sarah." Nalnish nodded once, as if her name was a gift he would treasure. Then he returned to preparing a simple meal, rabbit stew with wild herbs that filled the cave with a rich, earthy smell. As they ate in comfortable silence, Sarah found herself watching this stranger who had saved her life. There was something deeply peaceful about him, as if he carried the vast quiet of the desert within himself. When their eyes met across the fire, she didn't look away. For the first time in her marriage, she felt truly seen by a man, not as property or a burden, but as a person worth saving. Outside the cave, coyotes began their evening song, and Sarah pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she was safe. Tonight she was healing. Dawn broke slowly over the desert mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee brewing over the small fire. Her body ached, but the sharp edges of pain had dulled overnight. She sat up carefully, testing her movements. Nalnish stood at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the morning light. He held a tin cup in his hands, steam rising from the hot coffee. Without turning around, he said quietly, "How do you feel?" "Better," Sarah replied, and meant it. She was surprised to realize it was true, not just physically, but in some deeper way she couldn't quite name. He brought her the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly as he handed her the cup. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot drink. Sarah studied his face in the morning light, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow and the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't always been so serious. "You have somewhere to go?" Nalnish asked, settling cross-legged near the fire. Sarah hesitated. The truth was, she had nowhere. No family who would take her in, no friends who would risk their reputations by helping a woman who'd left her husband. The small amount of money she'd taken from Thomas's drawer wouldn't last long. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back." Nalnish nodded, as if he understood perfectly. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "The desert teaches patience," he said. "Answers come when they're ready." It was a strange conversation, more about what wasn't said than what was. But Sarah found comfort in his acceptance of her situation. He didn't press for details about her past or offer hollow reassurances about her future. Instead, he simply existed in the present moment with her, and that felt like a kind of gift. Over the following days, they fell into an easy rhythm. Nalnish would leave each morning to hunt or gather supplies, always returning by midday with fresh meat, water, or medicinal plants. Sarah used the quiet hours to rest and heal, both physically and emotionally. In the afternoons, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Sarah learned that Nalnish had been living alone in these mountains for 3 years, ever since his wife and daughter died in a cavalry attack on his village. The loss had driven him to seek solitude, to find peace in the ancient ways of his people, away from the violence that seemed to follow wherever Apaches and white settlers crossed paths. "I thought I wanted to be alone forever," he told her one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "But loneliness and solitude are not the same thing." Sarah understood. She had been lonely for years, even while sharing a bed with Thomas. True companionship wasn't about filling silence with words or sharing space with another person. It was about being known and accepted exactly as you were. As her body healed, Sarah began to help around the camp. She mended Nalnish's torn shirt with careful stitches, gathered firewood, and learned to prepare some of the wild plants he brought back. Her hands, soft from her town life, began to develop small calluses from the work. The desert sun darkened her skin and brought out more freckles across her nose. "Your husband," Nalnish said one afternoon, as they worked together to repair a torn section of the brush that concealed the cave entrance. "He will look for you." It wasn't a question, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar fear. She had been trying not to think about Thomas, hoping that perhaps he would simply let her go. But she knew better. He would see her leaving as a theft of his property, a challenge to his authority that couldn't go unanswered. "Yes," she said quietly, "he will." Nalnish studied her face, reading the fear there. "We will be ready," he said simply. The word "we" sent a flutter through Sarah's chest. When had she become part of something again? When had this quiet Apache man decided her safety was worth risking his own carefully maintained solitude? That night, as they sat by the fire sharing another simple meal, Sarah found herself really looking at Nalnish. Not just seeing him, but truly observing. The way his hands moved with unconscious grace as he ate, the careful way he listened, not just to her words, but to the spaces between them. The strength in his shoulders and arms that spoke of a life lived in harmony with this harsh landscape. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "My grandmother used to say that the desert sends us what we need, when we need it. Sometimes it sends hardship to make us stronger. Sometimes it sends healing." He looked up at her then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Sometimes it sends another heart that understands what it means to survive." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude for being seen so clearly by another human being. As the fire burned lower, they prepared for sleep. Sarah had grown accustomed to the sounds of the desert at night, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. But tonight, she was aware of something else, the quiet rhythm of Nalnish's breathing from across the cave, steady and reassuring. For the first time since her childhood, Sarah fell asleep, feeling completely safe. But in her dreams, she heard the thunder of horses' hooves and Thomas's angry voice calling her name across the desert wind. The sound that woke Sarah was wrong, too rhythmic, too purposeful for the natural symphony of the desert. Her eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart already racing with recognition. Horses, multiple riders, moving through the canyon below. Across the cave, Nalnish was already awake, crouched at the entrance and peering through a gap in the concealing brush. The tension in his shoulders told Sarah everything she needed to know. After 10 days of peace, her past had finally caught up with her. "How many?" she whispered, moving quietly to join him. "4 men. They're following the trail you took." His voice was calm, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, the swift assessment of a man who had survived by always thinking 3 moves ahead. Through the brush, Sarah could make out the shapes of riders in the canyon below. Even in the dim light, she recognized the broad shoulders and aggressive posture of the man leading them. Thomas Mitchell, her husband, accompanied by his 2 brothers and the town sheriff, men who had never questioned Thomas's version of any story. "Sarah!" Thomas's voice echoed off the canyon walls, loud and commanding. "I know you're out here somewhere. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Sarah's hands began to shake. She pressed them against her knees, trying to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Nalnish noticed her trembling and moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "You don't have to go back," he said quietly. "We can wait them out. They don't know about this place." But Sarah knew Thomas better than that. He was a man who viewed persistence as a virtue and surrender as weakness. He would search every cave, every overhang, every possible hiding place until he found her. And when he did, he wouldn't just punish her. He would destroy anyone who had helped her. "He won't give up," she said, her voice barely audible. And if he finds you helped me. She couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what would happen. Apache lives held little value in the eyes of men like Thomas Mitchell. Below them, the riders had dismounted and were examining the ground near a distinctive red rock formation. Sheriff Brennan pointed toward the mountain, his voice carrying on the still air. "Tracks lead up this way. Fresh ones." Nalnish studied the scene below with the focused intensity of a hunter. "There's another way out of the canyon," he said. "An old path through the rocks. We could reach my horse before they find this cave." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She could run again, deeper into the wilderness, further from civilization. But for how long? And what kind of life would that be for Nalnish, a man who'd already lost everything to violence? "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she felt. "If I keep running, this will never end. He'll keep following, keep threatening anyone who helps me." "Sarah!" She turned to face him, memorizing the concerned expression on his weathered features. In the 10 days she had known him, this quiet Apache man had shown her more kindness and respect than her husband had in 3 years of marriage. The thought of Thomas destroying him, was unbearable. "I won't let him hurt you because of me," she said firmly. "I won't let you pay for my choices." Something shifted in Nalnish's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a strength in her that she was only just discovering in herself. He reached out and touched her hand gently, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "The choice is mine to make," he said. "I stand with you." The simple words hit Sarah like a physical force. No one had ever stood with her before. Not her parents, who had sold her to Thomas for his money and position. Not the townspeople, who had turned away from her bruises. Not even herself. Until this moment. Down in the canyon, Thomas's voice rang out again. "Sarah, I'm trying to be patient here, but you're testing me. You know what happens when you test me." The threat in his tone made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread, but something else rose up to meet that fear. Anger, hot and clean. Anger at the years of walking on eggshells, of accepting blame for his violence, of believing his claims that she deserved his fists. "There's something you should know," she said to Nalnish, turning away from the cave entrance. "About why I left. About what kind of man Thomas really is." Nalnish waited, patient as always, as Sarah found the courage to speak truths she had hidden for years. She told him about the bruises that Thomas had explained away to the townspeople. Clumsiness, he claimed, women being naturally fragile. She described the way he controlled every aspect of her life, from her clothing to her friendships to the food she ate. She spoke of the night she had finally decided to leave, when Thomas had beaten her unconscious for speaking to the postmaster without his permission. As she talked, she watched Nalnish's face carefully. She had expected judgment, or at the very least, discomfort. Instead, she saw only quiet understanding and a growing steel in his dark eyes. "Among my people," he said when she finished, "a man who raises his hand against a woman is no man at all. He is less than the lowest creature that crawls in the dust." The conviction in his voice gave Sarah strength she didn't know she possessed. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "If we're going to face him, we face him together, as equals." Nalnish smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his serious features, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before loss had carved its mark on his soul. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the searchers were getting closer. Sarah could hear Sheriff Brennan's voice. "There's definitely something up here, Tom. Fresh sign, no more than a day old." Sarah and Nalnish moved swiftly but quietly around the cave, gathering the few essential supplies they would need. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she helped him prepare. Whatever was coming, they would meet it standing upright. As the first rays of true dawn light slanted through the canyon, illuminating the red rock walls like ancient fire, Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath and prepared to fight for her freedom. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing her demons alone. The confrontation came sooner than Sarah had hoped. As she and Nalnish prepared to leave through the hidden back passage, the sound of boots on stone echoed from directly below their cave. Thomas had found them. "I can smell the smoke from that fire," the sheriff's voice called out. "Whoever's up there, come out peaceful-like." Sarah felt her resolve waver for a moment, the old habit of submission rising like bile in her throat. But Nalnish's steady presence beside her anchored her to this new version of herself, the woman who had chosen to fight rather than flee. "Stay behind me," Nalnish murmured, checking the rifle he'd taken from their supplies. "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "This is my battle. I need to face him myself." She pushed through the concealing brush and stepped out onto the rocky ledge above the canyon floor. 20 feet below, 4 men looked up at her with varying expressions. Thomas with cold fury, his brothers with cruel anticipation, and Sheriff Brennan with something that might have been relief. "There she is!" Thomas called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Come down here, Sarah. Time to come home." The word home hit Sarah like a slap. Home had been a place of fear and pain, where she had learned to make herself small and silent. But standing here on this ledge, with the vast desert stretching out behind her and a man who truly saw her by her side, Sarah realized she had already found her real home. "I'm not coming back, Thomas," she called down. Her voice carried clearly in the still morning air, stronger than she had ever heard it before. Thomas's face darkened with the familiar rage that had terrorized her for years. "The hell you're not. You're my wife, and you'll do as I say." "I'm nobody's property," Sarah replied. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I never was." Sheriff Brennan shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to avoid bloodshed, but bound by his relationship with the Mitchell family. "Now, Mrs. Mitchell, this ain't the way to handle marital disputes. Come down, and we'll talk this through civilized-like." A bitter laugh escaped Sarah's throat. "Civilized? Sheriff, when was the last time you asked about these bruises?" She pushed up her sleeves, displaying the yellow-green remnants of Thomas's most recent violence. "When did you ever question why I hadn't been seen in town for weeks at a time?" Brennan's face flushed and he looked away. Like most men in their circle, he had chosen willful blindness over uncomfortable confrontation. But Sarah was no longer willing to protect his conscience. "You've been filling her head with ideas," Thomas snarled, his attention shifting to Nalnish, who had stepped up beside Sarah. "I should have known. A savage and a whore. Perfect match." The slur hit its target, sending a flush of shame through Sarah's chest. But before she could retreat into old patterns of self-blame, Nalnish spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had survived far worse than insults. "Your words show what you are," he said simply. "They have no power over what we are." Thomas's hand moved to the gun at his hip, and suddenly the standoff shifted from bitter words to deadly serious. "I've got the law on my side," he called up. "Sheriff Brennan's here as witness. That woman is my legal wife, and you're holding her against her will." "The only person who ever held me against my will was you," Sarah said, taking a step closer to the edge. She could see the calculation in Thomas's eyes, the way he was measuring distance and angles, planning his next move. "Thomas," she continued, her voice carrying years of suppressed pain and anger. "I spent 3 years believing your lies, believing I deserved your fists. But I know better now. I know what respect looks like. I know what it feels like to be safe." Something shifted in the group below. One of Thomas's brothers, the younger one, Charlie, looked uncomfortable. He had always been the quieter of the two, and Sarah wondered if he had suspected more than he'd admitted about his brother's treatment of her. "Enough of this foolishness," Thomas snapped. He started climbing toward the ledge, his movements aggressive and determined. "You're coming home, Sarah, now." That's when Nalnish stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and her approaching husband. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, protection offered freely without expectation or demand. "She has chosen," Nalnish said calmly. "Honor that choice." Thomas paused in his climb, his face contorting with rage. "You think you can steal my wife and get away with it? You think your kind has any rights in this territory?" The hatred in his voice was ugly and familiar. Sarah had heard him speak this way about Apaches before, had watched him nod along when other men talked about the Indian problem. She had been too afraid then to recognize it for what it was, the same need to dominate and control that he had used against her. "I wasn't stolen," Sarah said, her voice ringing out across the canyon. "I was saved." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Thomas's face went white with fury, and Sarah saw his hand tighten on his gun. Time seemed to slow as she realized he was actually going to shoot, not just at Nalnish, but potentially at her as well. "Thomas, no!" Charlie's voice cracked like a whip across the canyon. "For God's sake, man, that's your wife!" The interruption broke Thomas's momentum for just a moment, long enough for Sheriff Brennan to step forward and place a restraining hand on the gun. "This has gone far enough," Brennan said firmly. "We came to bring Mrs. Mitchell home, not to start a shooting war." Sarah saw her chance and took it. "Sheriff Brennan," she called down, "I want you to witness something." She turned to face Nalnish, looking directly into his dark eyes. "This man saved my life. He asked for nothing in return, offered me shelter and safety when I had nowhere else to go. If you want to arrest someone for kidnapping, arrest my husband. For the 3 years he kept me prisoner in my own home." The accusation hit the group below like a thunderclap. Charlie stepped back from his brother, his face pale with dawning understanding. Even Brennan looked shaken, finally confronted with truths he had long ignored. But Thomas was beyond reason now. With a growl of pure rage, he shoved past the sheriff and resumed his climb, his gun drawn. "If I can't have you, no one can." That's when Sarah made her choice. Instead of retreating further into the cave or waiting for Nalnish to defend her, she stepped forward to the very edge of the ledge. The drop wasn't fatal, 20 feet onto sandy ground, but it was enough to make a statement. "I would rather die free than live as your prisoner," she said, her voice steady and sure. "That's how much I'd rather risk everything than spend another day afraid of you." For a moment, Thomas actually hesitated. Perhaps he was finally seeing her clearly, not as property or an object to be controlled, but as a human being with her own will and dignity. Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Mitchell, you have the right to seek a divorce through the territorial court. There are legal ways to end a marriage." It was the first time anyone in authority had acknowledged that she had options, that she had rights. Sarah felt tears of relief prick at her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "That's exactly what I intend to do." Thomas's gun wavered, then slowly lowered. The fight seemed to go out of him all at once, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his horse. Charlie lingered a moment longer, looking up at Sarah with what might have been respect. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have seen. I should have helped." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology she had never expected to receive. As the men mounted their horses and rode away, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Nalnish moved to stand beside her at the edge of the ledge, watching the riders disappear into the distance. "They will not be back," he said with quiet certainty. Sarah turned to study his profile, this man who had given her back her life without asking for anything in return. "What happens now?" she asked. Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the vast expanse of desert that stretched out before them. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of something Sarah had never heard from him before. "Hope. Now we live," he said simply. "However we choose." Sarah smiled, feeling the desert wind tug at her hair and the warm sun on her face. For the first time in years, the future stretched before her like an open trail, full of unknowns certainly, but also full of possibilities. And she would walk it with someone who saw her not as property to be owned, but as a person worthy of respect and care. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the clear blue sky, riding the thermals high above the Red Rock Canyon. Sarah watched it soar, free and wild and beautiful, and felt an answering wildness stirring in her own heart. She was free, and freedom, she was learning, was just the beginning.